My name is Brian Kwong, also known as the Salesforce Wizard due to my choice of head of payroll during Salesforce events. The previous episode provided an overview of the decision element. This series assumes you're familiar with the concepts reviewed in previous videos, so if you haven't seen them, check out the playlist to get caught up. This episode is all about resources in Flow. Resources in Flow hold data. This can be information from a record in Salesforce, something that we define, or something that gets set within the flow itself. There are 8 types of resources: variable, constant, formula, text template, choice, record choice set, pick list choice set, and stage. The most commonly used types of resources are variables, formulas, and choices. So let's go ahead and dive in and take a look at resources in Flow. There are a few different places that you can create resources. The first place is to create them from the Managers tab. Now, the Managers tab, you may recall from our overview video, shows everything that we've created within our flow. This includes resources. You can see we have a new resource button. We'll come back to this in a moment. The other is we can create them from elements themselves. Now, you may remember this screen from our decision element episode. We currently have a radio button with 3 items to choose from. Each of these items are a different resource. Specifically, they are a choice resource. Now, to add a 4th item, we click Add Choice, and then when we click into this blank spot that we have provided, we can see there's a new resource option. Clicking this is the equivalent of clicking it within the Manager tab. This is my preferred way of creating resources. It fits the way I build. I like to build my resources as I need them. Now, however, for this video, in order for us to look at all the different types of resources that we can use, we're going to use the new resource button from the Manager tab. When you click on the new resource button, the first thing we have to do is say what type of resource we're going to create. Like I said at the start of this video, there are 8 different types. And we're going to look at most of these today, but we're going to start with the most common one, and that is variable. Now, don't get too confused here because there are multiple different variables. All you need to remember is that a variable holds pieces of information. We're going to start with the API name. The API name is what this is going to be called within your flow. It's how you are going to refer to it in other places within the flow, and it must be unique within the flow. I'm a big believer of using a naming convention for my variables. So my preference is I like to start all my variables with the letters VR, short for variable. And that's simply because if I type VR someplace else in the flow, it's going to automatically filter down to all my variables. So we'll just call this variable example. The description field is nice to provide a reminder to yourself what this variable is for. Hopefully, this is really extra pieces of information because your naming convention that you just use to define your API name also includes enough information to determine what this is. Next is the data type, and there are lots of different data types. Some of these are very straightforward. Text is, well, text, it's a string value. Records, a record is something that is pulling from Salesforce. That could be an account, an opportunity, a case, contact. The rest of these are pretty common. Numbers are numbers, including items with decimals. Currencies are dollar values. Booleans are true or false. It's like a checkbox. Then we have date and date time. Date is a date time just without the time. So it's just saying December 18th, 2019 versus December 18th, 2019 at 12 o'clock. Pick list is pulling from a pick list field. Multi-select pick list, similar thing, but for multi-select pick list. An apex defined is something that you would use if you're pulling a value from an apex class. We're going to start by taking a look at records because these are one of the most common things you're going to be using in Flow in addition to text. Usually I will use text variables for things to hold like just an ID, something that gets passed into the flow. When we're using records, though, this is what we're going to use when we're grabbing data out of Salesforce. Say, I want to have a whole bunch of different accounts, or I just need one account. You need to know that from the get-go. So you need to know when you're defining this resource, are you going to be holding more than one account or just a single account? The default is you're only going to have one account possible. However, if you check this box, it's going to allow you to have more than one record in here. If you're familiar with the Cloud Designer, this was basically the equivalent of a record collection, an S-object collection. Here, however, we can define a collection right from this checkbox. There's no separate different things to represent one record versus multiple records beyond that checkbox. Because we're selecting a record, we have to define, well, what record we want to pull from. We're going to use accounts. And then we have to define if it's available for input or an output. This is very important. If you leave either of these boxes blank, it means it can only be referred to within this flow itself. If you select this for input, it means you can pass a value into this flow when you're calling the flow. For example, from Process Builder, or from Apex, or from a button. If it's available for output, it means that the value that gets in the flow can be passed outside of the flow, maybe back to an Apex class or to a different flow. For example, if we're going to use this as a subflow, which is a different show, you may pass this back to the original flow that called everything off. Most common is available for input. It's not required. You should only use it when you know you're going to be passing something from outside of the flow into the flow at the very start. And then you click done. That's it. You'll notice we didn't define anything about, well, which accounts do we want to take, how many accounts do we want to take, or anything. We simply defined if it's going to be holding more than one or not. That doesn't mean it has to hold more than one. Right now it holds 0. We would have to do something else to define and set the value for that collection. So let's take a look at some other items. Variables are the big one simply because of the fact there's so many different types. But you can imagine that you can create a text type, number, currency, Boolean, date, date time, and so forth. And they're pretty straightforward. You'll notice when I select the text, we have the exact same options as creating a record, with the exception of the fact that we don't define the S-object because we're not defining an object. However, we also have this default value. This is a good place to usually leave blank or null unless you need a very, very specific value when the flow gets called. So essentially, if we say, hey, the flow starts, I want to have this variable to have a very specific value at the very start of the flow, and it might change in the future. Let's move on and talk about constants. Constants are very, very similar to variables. As a matter of fact, you can see we have a lot of the same options for data types, except for we don't have records and pick list values. We do have numbers, text, currency, date, and Boolean. The difference between a constant and a variable is that a constant doesn't change. The value in a constant stays constant throughout the entire flow. So this is very nice if you want to say, hey, you know what? I always want to grab the same thing over and over and over again whenever I refer to it within the flow. That's perfectly fine. I don't use constants a whole lot. Most of the times I'm doing a variable. Okay, let's move on from constants to formulas. In flow, a formula is just like a field formula. You can basically use all the same functions that you can do in a field formula within flow. And as a matter of fact, I usually often like to build my formulas within a field formula and then copy and paste it over because I find it a lot easier to get access to the functions that are available in the formula through the formula builder. And for some reason, we do not have that as an option within Flow. Formulas also have multiple different data types. The common ones are going to be text, numbers, currencies, booleans, dates, and dates times. Most of the formulas I'm doing involve dates, where I'm going to say, hey, I want to take today's date and add 10 days, or numbers, or currency. I do often use text as a formula. An example of a formula would be, we want to have the ID of the user who's running the flow. And you can see here under global variables, we have a lot of different options. Any place where you see this $sign before the item is just like what we can do in formula. It's to grab values from something. In this case, $user is the user who's running the flow, and we have access to all the various pieces of information. This can be really nice if you want to build something that's very personalized, and you have a screen that says, hi, user's name. You can get the username by having a formula. By simply putting the .user ID into the formula field here, now every time I reference this formula resource, it's going to return the ID of the user who's currently running the flow. That's pretty darn cool. Formulas are also nice to do things like getting the time of day or going through and seeing if there's a certain permission. So custom permissions, absolutely amazing to use within your automation. So you're going to have a formula that says whether or not the person who's currently running the formula has a custom permission, and then use a decision to go through and say, you know, because you have this this custom permission, I'm going to let you proceed, or because you don't, we're going to stop until we're sorry, you don't get to use this particular type of flow. The power that you have using formulas can be immense. You can do everything from something as really simple as saying, hey, I want to go and take 2 + 4, right? That's 6. I mean, we can all do this, but we could do lots of other things. Your formulas don't have to have references to just hard-coded numbers or through the $. We can reference other items. So in this particular scenario, I have a whole bunch of different values. So if I want to go through and say, you know, I want an outcome that lists the values from path 1, path 2, and path 3, I can go through, add path 1, path 2, path 3, and I could go ahead and put some wonderful pieces of logic in between those to be able to create a text string that I could then use maybe on a display output. It can be also very powerful if you need to concatenate different pieces of information together. We already talked about moving things and calculating days. Formulas are incredibly powerful within Flow. Similar to a formula is what's called a text template. The difference between a text template and the formula is, well, this is always going to be text. You notice there's no data type option here. We do have ways to pull in the other variables and resources that we have within our flow. This is really nice for generating what I like to use for messaging. So for example, one of the things I will do if I have a screen is I'll create a debug screen. And in that debug screen, I will have an output text. And the output text will reference the text template. The text template will literally just say, here are the variables within the flow. And I will have my text template look like, hey, this is VR record ID, followed by a colon and a space, and then I'll input the variable value. And I'll do a new line, I'll do the next variable, and the next variable, and the next variable. In this way, if I'm trying to figure out why something isn't working within the flow, I can interject that screen someplace within the flow and say, hey, when I run this, show me a screen of what the values are for these variables at the time I get to that screen. It can be really, really useful from a debugging standpoint. It's also useful if you're trying to cut together messaging for like a chatter post or an email where you need to have lots of different types of text and maybe pieces of information from other places in the flow. You can build it within a text template and then just reference the text template within the chatter post or email or so forth. Vastly easier than trying to build those multiple pieces within the single value of the chatter post. The nice thing about it is it means that if you have to change something, you just come and edit the text template. You don't have to edit anything else. Choices we already look at. They're basically values for a drop down or a radio button that only exist for the flow. They don't exist anywhere else. Record choice sets. I believe this used to be called dynamic choices. Essentially what it lets you do is you pick an object, and let's go ahead and pick the account object. And we do what looks similar to getting records. In this case, going out and getting a whole bunch of accounts. We can specify to say, hey, I either want to get all accounts, no conditions, or I only want accounts that meet certain criteria. That's where conditions are met. We can sort them. We can limit the number of choices. And then we have a label. So the label is effectively, well, the field name here. And then we can say what the data type is and what would the value be. And effectively what we would end up doing here is instead of having to create a choice for every type of value you would want in a pick list or a radio button, we can use our existing data in Salesforce to display the values that would show up in that pick list. This could be really useful if you wanted to do something along the lines of choose an account before you can move forward, right? So here's a list of all the accounts that you own that meet some sort of criteria. Pick one from the radio button to use for the rest of this automation. I don't use record choice sets that commonly. It does happen, mainly for the circumstance where I want someone to be able to pick from multiple records. But it's not as popular for me as it used to be now that we have things like pick list choice sets. Pick list choice sets are exactly what it sounds like. It lets you create a series of choices based on a pick list or a multi-select pick list. So here's a bunch of pick lists that we have. For example, account type. We can set the default order. And effectively what this gives you is your pick list that you've already defined on an object available within your flow standalone without having to grab any other data. Pick list choices are really, really helpful if you are using flow to create or edit records and you want to kind of mimic the feel that a user has when they're usually editing the record. So if it's a pick list, you can still give them a pick list. It's very nice. Stage. I'm not going to go too far into stage because it is more what I consider a more advanced concept, but essentially we can define stages of our flow itself. We're not going to dive into the uses of stages right now. That is a different video. Okay, so now we've looked at screens, we've looked at decisions, and we talked about resources. We now have the foundation to build our very first functional flow. In the next video, we're going to do just that. We're going to build a flow that uses those three concepts, a screen, decision, and resources, to build a flow that you can use for fun in your everyday basis. I mean, it'll give you the capability to build some really basic flow functionality before we move on to more complicated concepts. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to get a cool shirt like this, you can go to thewizardnews.com/shop and you'll find shirts like this as well as stickers, coffee mugs, notepads, and even pillows. You can also support us by shopping through our Amazon affiliate link, which you'll find in the description, as well as to thewizardnews.com under the Support Me menu. To get more videos, make sure you hit the subscribe button and then click on the bell icon to get the notifications of all the future videos. Remember, the magic is out there. It's yours for the taking.